This is the South African history of ANC and Umkhonto weSizwe MK in exile. Following British victory in the South African War, the Union of South Africa was forged in 1910 under the British Commonwealth. The Union brought together the defeated independent Boer republics and British colonies. For the most part during the development of this union, the government was in the hands of the pro-British South Africa Party and United Party, which were led by Prime Minister Louis Botha and later Prime Minister Jan Smuts. The Afrikaner National Party held power at some point 1925 to 1934, but it was largely managed by entering into a coalition with the Labour Party first and later the Unionists Party and South Africa Party. As a result of these coalitions, the party was not strong enough to unilaterally pursue its domestic and foreign policies. The growth of Afrikaner nationalism reached its momentum after the Second World War. This was shown during the Second World War when Afrikaner people were split between the pro-German and pro-British lobby. The National Party NP, as a representative of the pro-German lobby, was displeased with fighting on the side of what they thought of as a British war of imperialism. During both wars, the Afrikaner people and NP attempted to prevent the Union from supporting the British, but these attempts failed. In 1948, shortly after the war, the NP won the national election with a strong majority compared to previous years. The NP was an overtly racist party committed to a policy of separate development, which would further entrench legislated segregation based on race. This best evident in the 1950s as the government passing a series of legislation that divided people based on race. For instance, the passing of the Separation of Communism Act, the Population Registration Act, the Group Areas Act, the Immorality Amendment Act, the Reservation of Separate Amenities Act, Separate Representation of Voters Act, among others. The government's determination to enforce apartheid despite criticism from the Commonwealth of Nations led to the NP's unilateral declaration of independence from Britain and pulling out of the Commonwealth in 1961. The Liberation Movement and Exile. These political transformations had a tremendous impact on South Africa's liberation movements. The African National Congress, ANC, South Africa Communist Party, SACP, the Indian Congress, and other parties began to seek alternative ways of fighting apartheid with increased determination. Initially, South African liberation movements were committed to a policy of non-violence and constructive engagement with the government. The increasing of the security forces of brutally suppress resistance and torture those fought against the government's racially biased policies convinced the ANC that military option could succeed where non-violence had failed. Consequently, the armed wing of the ANC, Umkhonto weSizwe MK, was formed in 1961 jointly by the ANC and SACP to spearhead the armed struggle. A positive development for the ANC was an increased tide of independent African states in the 1960s. Coupled with the growing influence of Pan-Africanism and African nationalism in the foreign policy of these states, most of them were committed to the liberation of Africa as a whole from a colonial rule and apartheid. Thus, they supported the liberation struggle through the institutions such as the Organization of African Unity. The ANC was supported by a member of African states which hosted ANC leaders fleeing from increasing repression by the apartheid state. In some countries, they were allowed to stay as refugees but not allowed to establish military bases, while in others, they could establish military training camps. From these countries, MK operated and coordinated the liberation struggle abroad and in South Africa. Though committed to the principle of supporting liberation movements in African colonies, efforts of some African countries were limited by their economic weakness and dependence on their former colonial masters. Aware of this weakness, South Africa adopted what is called a new policy to entice African states into closer cooperation and friendly relationship with her in return for financial aid, mainly in the form of technical aid. This was on condition that they did not support the ANC and MK activities within their borders. In instances where the desired outcomes by the South African government were not met, a deliberate policy of aggression was adopted. For instance, the South African government embarked on a deliberate policy of destabilization by funding armed groups and associations of the political activists. Neighboring countries like Botswana, Lesotho, Mozambique and Swaziland were especially vulnerable. Despite these threats, these countries and others such as Tanzania, Angola, Zambia and Mozambique played an important role in supporting the South African liberation struggle. Furthermore, the MK campaign abroad extended to other countries in Europe and the Soviet Union where MK cadres received military training. This feature will examine in detail MK activities in a number of African countries and briefly the international support from non-African countries. BACHWANALAND, now Botswana, was declared a British Protectorate by a decree in March 1885 and incorporated into the British colony encompassing South Africa. Under British rule, several attempts were made to merge southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, but they were all unsuccessful. Later, when the Southern Union was established in 1910, 3 protectorates, Bechuanaland, Swaziland and Basotholand, were established and excluded from the Union. It was envisaged that they would be incorporated later when a proper native policy was approved by the British government. This was vehemently opposed by the traditional leaders who sought to preserve their influence rather cede it to the colonial government. Consequently, Bechuanaland remained under the administration of the British government until its independence. In the 1930s, local chiefs began demanding self-government and more independence from the British government. The latter rejected their demands, arguing that the Botswana were not yet ready for self-government. The desire for independence manifested itself in the formation of independent African churches and schools. In 1959, the Federal Party, FP, the first African political party in Botswana, was formed by Lethile Disang Radihladi, a playwright and poet. As the process of decolonization across the African continent began in the 1950s, Britain felt the pressure to relinquish control of its African colonies. In 1961, a new constitution which provided for an advisory executive council, a representative legislative council, and an advisory African council was inaugurated. The council was heavily in favor of presenting white minority rule, as out of the 34 members of the Legislative Council, only 10 were Botswana. Around this period, the shortly lived FP was succeeded by the BACHWANALAND People Party BPP under the leadership of Dr. Kgalemang Motsete, with Motsamai Mpho as the Secretary General. Mpho was a treason trialist in South Africa before moving back to Botswana. Now the BPP began demanding full independence from Britain. In 1962, the Bechuanaland Democratic Party, BDP, was founded by Senetse Khama, a chief of the Gwato ethnic group. In March 1965, the BDP won the country's first national elections and Senetse Khama became Prime Minister. However, it was not until 30 September 1966 that the government of Botswana gained independence from Britain. After independence, Khama became the country's first president. He was re-elected for another term in 1969 after his party won the election that year. Surrounded by a hostile enemy. The president of Botswana, Senetse Khama, was acutely aware of his country's weaknesses in the context of Cold War politics, as well as the moral imperative to support South Africa's liberation from white minority rule. Compared to Lesotho and Swaziland, the government of Botswana was very vocal about its opposition to apartheid. Moreover, the country's relationship with the government of South Africa was, for the most part, characterized by tension. At independence, Botswana was surrounded by two hostile states under minority rule. South Africa was in the south and southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, in the east. In the west and north was bordered by Southwest Africa, now Namibia, mandated to South Africa under the mandate system introduced by Jan Smuts after the First World War. Border disputes saw tensions rising with regard to the point at which the three countries bordered each other. South Africa and Rhodesia claimed that the crossing provided no room for the construction of the bridge or road without altering the borders of the other states. In short, they claimed that Botswana was completely surrounded by South Africa and Rhodesia. Botswana's economic weakness and lack of the professional military to protect her territorial integrity or deter any attack from these two giants of South African ensured that Botswana's opposition to apartheid was largely vocal. However, the government of Botswana acted as a host to refugees fleeing political violence in South Africa. Topic to be continued in the next video. And that's it from Injibs Network. Stay tuned to our celebrity and gossip news.